Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. So I first encountered Mary Catherine McDonald through her powerful presence on social media, where she consistently shares insightful perspectives on trauma and healing. Her way of showing up with authenticity and clarity immediately drew me in, and I was further captivated when I heard her speak on several podcasts and at a recent online trauma conference, where her depth of knowledge and her insights left a lasting impression. So Mary Catherine's ability to articulate the complexities of trauma while offering hope and practical guidance has encouraged me to invite her onto the podcast as a guest. So about this week's guest. Mary Catherine, or MC for short, PhD, is a research professor and life coach who specialises in the psychology of trauma, stress and resilience. She has been researching, lecturing and publishing on the neuroscience, psychology and lived experience of trauma and stress for over a decade. She is passionate about destigmatizing trauma, stress and mental health issues in general, as well as reframing our understanding of trauma in order to better understand and treat it. So welcome, Catherine. It's so nice to have you here on a podcast.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful introduction. I'm so glad to be here with you.
How are you today?
It's funny, this is going to sound like a long story, but when I was in a very acute grief phase of my life at one point, I started going to yoga daily. And no matter what kind of mood I was in Shavasana at the end of class and corpse pose, I would start to cry. And I was really frustrated because I wanted out of the acute grief phase. And I was thinking, really? Like every day we're going to still be crying? But I, over time, got this vision of just little me in a little boat and this ocean of grief underneath me. And if I just reach my hand out of the boat, I can touch that water, that sadness, that depth, that beauty, the whole thing. And as you were just talking, you have such a lovely open presence that I was feeling that like those emotions are right on the surface. I can reach right out of the boat and feel the tears, the depth, the beauty, all of it. So I am good, and I'm little me in a little boat on an ocean of grief.
What a beautiful image you drew for us here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So as always, I start with my guest, wherever they come from, wherever area they work in, with asking you to tell us and the listener in that specific sense about how grief, loss and trauma has informed your life, how it has brought you to where you are today, doing what you're doing.
My grief origin story is not a story that I often tell. I came to grief in my first love relationship. The first time I fell in love was with a boy who had cystic fibrosis, which is terminal. And so my first relationship was sort of kind of embedded, entangled, woven with death. And, there was, of course, a teenage hope that there would be a cure, and I think that's a beautiful thing. But I became very interested in grief very, very young, like 13.
Wow.
And after he died, I decided to focus. I was, always very interested in the afterlife and spirituality and what happens on the other side of this experience that we're all having here. And I, through him, I think, got interested in like this period of our lives that we are often in, which is this grief ocean. And so when I was doing my master's degree, I decided to focus on grieving and really look into what is mourning, right? What does that mean psychologically? What does it mean spiritually? What does it mean philosophically? How do we do it? Are there roadmaps? Because I believe we live in a grief-phobic culture. And so there was no roadmap. There's very little out there to help you on your way. And then when I was in the course of doing that master's degree, both of my parents unexpectedly died.
Wow.
And so I was really thrown into the lived experience as well as the sort of academic, safer to me, sort of intellectual sort of exploration of it. And so I just kept going. And I'm so grateful for all of that and how it unfolded, because I don't think I would have survived if I hadn't already been studying grief, because it enabled me to both, engage with all of these figures in history who had written about their own grief, and also to approach grief from an intellectual place, which helped balance out the sort of somatic bodied waves of grief that I was not prepared for.
So, I knew that your parents died, so I wasn't as shocked when I heard it now. But I'm assuming that some of the listeners, they just heard you talk about the story of your first love. And then just in one sentence, you said, I was doing my master's and then unexpected, my two parents died. And I was feeling that resonance because I'm also imagining I'm a listener here. I'm like, oh my God, what age were you and what happened to them? Just to give a little bit of context, because I know some of my listeners are bereaved young adults.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a really isolating experience. I was 24. My father died first, and then my mother died about a year and a half later. They both had a late stage colon cancer, and neither of them knew about it. My father didn't, it's not that he didn't take his symptoms seriously. I think he thought he was so active and kind of young and robust. He was only 62, that when he got sick, I think he was like, oh, well, I'll sort this. We don't need to really spend a lot of time on it. But he was only sick for about 10 days. He was only diagnosed for about 10 days. So he had been sick kind of that whole year. And then he, right around Thanksgiving, was like, okay, we have to go to the doctor. And then he died on Christmas morning. And then my mom had all of these symptoms, but she sort of chalked them up to grief and resisted going to the doctor because, as you know, grief is also really hard on the body. And so it was kind of easy to contextualize those symptoms as part of the grieving process. And then in February, not the next February, but the year after that, she also died. So I was 25. Both of my parents were gone. And
in such a short amount of time as a very young adult.
Right. And people are just unprepared to deal with you, right? Like no one, I didn't know a single person. And I, at the time, worked in an office where a lot of my coworkers were kind of all over the place in terms of age range. Some of them were in their 60s, still had both of their parents. I didn't know a single person in my graduate program anywhere who had lost a parent, let alone both. And so not only do you kind of not have anyone to relate to you, but also people don't know how to relate to you.
Exactly.
And they don't know what to say. And so I switched right after my mom died. I switched my grad program to my PhD program. I left one school and went to another. And I didn't actually tell anyone that my parents died because I just was so tired of this becoming such a confusing thing for other people, And I was like, I just want to meet everyone. I don't want to be the orphan, It felt very strange for people to call me an orphan when I felt like I was an adult. But looking back now, 24 is so young. And yes, I was an adult and I was living on my own in New York and, kind of making it and all that other stuff, but also really at sea,
That's amazing because looking back now, I can see some of my clients who are semi-orphaned or like one parent died. And Yeah, no, if I think about it, do I know someone who's lost both of their parents or had a client? I probably would say no. I would have to think a little bit harder. But especially at your age, when I hear you speak about being in graduate school and then all these people relating to each other, wanting to have a good life. And I'm just thinking about a client who's about that age and she's dealing with the loss of her mother, but it was already 10 years ago. But it's still, it's like, it's not something that people can relate to in any way. And also, to some degree, don't know and don't want to, because it's like, it's way too scary to think about.
Right.
So, I mean, how did you deal with it at that time?
Very badly at first. I had no coping tools. You know, I grew up in a household where you were to manage your emotions, right? And like kind of keep them down. And so I learned how I'm not inherently good at that. I'm a very sensitive human. I arrived that way. But I learned how to sort of, haphazardly do that. And so I was very productive. And I thought, okay, if I can just I was working full time, I was going to school full time. And I was like, if I can just keep everything in motion, I'll be okay. So I used my productivity as sort of a measuring stick of how okay I was, instead of resting, instead of feeling, instead of letting the waves hit. And so I made it that way for about 6 months. And then I had what could probably be defined as a breakdown, like just could not function, anxiety. I was afraid. I mean, this is kind of intense, but I was so anxious and needed it to stop so badly that I was afraid I was going to end my life, not because I didn't want to live, but because I couldn't handle feeling that way anymore. And so I spent sort of 2 weeks. I took 2 weeks off of work. I have never done that before or since. And just sort of like kind of held on, found a therapist, called the therapist and said, I'm struggling, my father died. I'm struggling with a bit of anxiety. I'm not sure if it's related. I hope we could do maybe 6 or 12 sessions and then I could be back to normal, like not understanding that I was about to have to relearn basically everything down to like how to walk, you have to relearn how to be in the world. And so after that 2 weeks, I started on this very long journey of relearning how to be in the world, how to let grief stand next to me and how to trust it and trust myself. And I think I'm still on that road. I think it takes forever. I've come a very, very long way, but yeah, in the beginning, I just didn't.
Yeah. I mean, losing a parent is also something that people can't use a replacement statement like, oh, you can have another boyfriend when you lost your boyfriend, or you will probably have another baby, unless in my case that wasn't probably the case, but they can use the replacement strategy. But in terms of parents, it's nothing that replaces mom and dad. Not even a step parent. It's never a replacement. That mom and dad are just one of a kind.
Yeah. And you have all these these milestones in the future that you have written them into without realizing that they might not be able to be there, like your wedding, or if you graduate from something, or if you have, if you buy a house or move across the country, like you sort of expect and imagine your parents to be in attendance at those things. And then so when you encounter those milestones in life and they're not there, it's like you get sort of like, knocked over all over again.
Exactly. Every time. Like, so my mother died 12 and a half years ago when my daughter was just 4.5 months old. So my twin daughters were born September 11, and then my younger twin died 3 days old, and then my mother died 4.5 months later through suicide. But then again, same as you were saying, I mean, death like that you don't expect per se, but it was something that was in the making or in the coming, that we could see why it was happening in retrospect. But as you were saying, all these things that I then lived without my mother raising a baby, and she loved babies, to not being able to ask her, or the first Mother's Day I had as a mother was also without my mother. It's so confusing. All these things again and again. And yeah, it's not known as what comes again as a reminder. Okay, well, she's not here.
Right. And also grieving your baby and not having her to be someone that you could ask, even just to grieve with, right? Not even to
Yeah.
ask how to do that grief, but like, oh, that's so awful.
So, how did you learn to live in this world as a young adult without both of your parents?
Very slowly. I think that what I wish someone had told me in the beginning, and I say that, but I don't know. It's possible someone did tell me this and I just didn't listen or couldn't hear this. Um, you don't lose the whole relationship when you lose a person. The especially if you've known someone your entire life, you know what they would say, you know their stance on things, you know their sense of humor, the way they go about being in the world, the whole thing. And so um I think as I have gotten deeper into the grief process, the I've been surprised at how present my parents still are. Of course, they're absent, right? That's undeniable, but I think I've been surprised by the presence of them. And so I think as I kept going, which is really just what I just kept going and just kept going and really kept hitting the same walls and thankfully had incredible therapists in my, on my road. I started to feel their presence more and realize that the relationship in some really important sacred sense goes on with you. And so I think in some sense I feel like I have them more now than I did when I was 24 before they died, right? Because I wasn't even fully formed yet. And
Yeah.
so I'm still in conversation with them. And I think in those, especially in those years where I was trying to make big decisions about my life and career and relationships and all of that. I kind of wish I had leaned on that a little bit more instead of focusing so much on the lack, because I think it would have been orienting and guiding. But that's easy to kind of look back and criticize yourself. So how did I go on?
Hindsight, right?
Right, exactly, right. I just kind of went forward and found anyone that I could who could help, really.
Mm.
I think that's so important, this idea of like, support. Um, People can
Absolutely.
really, really help you and kind of guide you on your path. And again, when we live in a grief phobic culture, that's really hard to see because you don't even know who to look for.
Mm-hmm.
But there will always be people who are standing there right next to you on your path with a flashlight saying, I know, let's just take two more steps, you know?
Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing that's what, at least in my case, and probably also in your case, has led you to where you are now. What drew you to be so passionate about researching grief, trauma, stress, resilience? So what led from where you were at 24, 25 to
Yeah.
where you are now? So maybe draw a little bit of a
Yeah.
lifeline for us here.
Yeah. It's good that you made this wavy hand because it was not a straight line at all. I moved on from studying grief. I finished my master's degree and kind of thought like, okay, well now I understand how to grieve, which by the way, no, the universe will bring another kind of loss and tell you that remind you that you
Try
don't.
again. Try
Right,
again.
exactly. You don't know that much actually. And I started studying identity because I was really fascinated by sort of what, we have these sort of like, shattering events in our lives that seem to be a fork in the road for many people, and they seem to shape your identity in one or more ways. And so that made me think about, okay, well, then what is identity and what does it mean to have a self? And so I started studying narrative and identity. And there was this huge debate that was going on in the philosophy of psychology at the time, which doesn't really matter. But I reached for trauma because there were a lot of stories in the newspaper at the time in the US about soldiers that were coming back from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and how traumatized they were and how badly prepared we were as a society to help them. And I thought, okay, well, here's a shattering event that happens that nobody can deny, right? And this seems to show us that the identity of a person is, in some sense, at least a story. And because if some event can happen that can shatter the story, then the identity was the story in some sense. And so how can we look at things that are so huge, like combat trauma, and help somebody reorient themselves in their own story? So I moved very far away from my own experience for about 10 years and started working with populations and with research about previously incarcerated folks and people who were in the gang world and veterans who are coming home and trying to reintegrate after their military careers, and really kind of thought that trauma didn't apply to me because I was studying all these cases that were so, we had almost no lived experience in common at all. And yet I also found that there was this huge affinity between me and the people that I was working with. And they would often say things like, you really get it. You're the first person I've talked to that gets it. And I was like, really? Like, I actually don't know. Like, I don't get it. I have not at all been through anything similar, but I think these like core experiences of terror or being trapped or, not being able to trust your own perceptions because your anxiety is so high that you can't even see straight, those are things that we all have in common. And so very gradually I started to realize like, oh, wait, I think that I might have some trauma in my life as well.
There's sort of backdoor story, yes. Oh,
right. And like, again, like 10 years in, like doing a PhD, looking at all these symptoms, talking to all these people and being like, oh, that must be tough, right? Like it's not my own lived experience. We have an incredible ability to sort of separate ourselves from our own life when we're not ready to look at it yet. So
yeah. Actually, when you were talking about at the beginning, when you drew the line,
yeah,
I sort of could sense, not clearly, I can cognitively explain that, but it was like a parallel to you. And then I had this picture of the soul saying, okay, let's make a little bit of a detour because going straight parallel might be too much. Let's take a detour. Yes. And then people would say, oh, you get me. I'm like, me? So right. I just had that sensation, that picture as a resonance to what you were saying. So interesting.
And that's the hand motion you made, which is exactly, that's what it was. This gentle, like, no, maybe look at that. Like, but then this return to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So I love the subtitle of your book, Unbroken, which is the trauma response is never wrong. So if we're taking that to your situation, I mean, losing both of your parents in such a short time as a young parent in itself is untimely, is in your case also the way you said your father was diagnosed and died 10 days later is unexpected. So how would you explain to someone who's experiencing something like you that their response, whether they might realize it's traumatic grief or just grief, doesn't actually matter the terminology, but how would you explain to them, hey, your response, your nervous system's response is actually not wrong?
Yeah, I think that if I could wave a magic wand and just sort of like install this knowledge into every human, I would love that, because we've had such a storied past when we look at how we've talked about trauma and how we've talked about grief, and we so often view it as a weakness or a sign of dysfunction. But what the biology shows us, as we have learned more about the brain and the nervous system and how these things work together, is that we have an incredibly wise and sophisticated set of coping mechanisms that kick into gear without our intervention. Like without us knowing or choosing or thinking about it, these emergency coping systems kick into gear to help us survive, to make sure that we survive. And so you can look at that in a really simple example. Like if you get woken up in the middle of the night, your resting heart rate and your blood pressure and your respiration rate are at the lowest that they are all day. But you hear this noise, your brain registers it as potential danger, and then your body responds in milliseconds by altering function of all processes in your body. So all of a sudden you go from, your heart rate is like maybe 48 to 110, and you're breathing quickly and you're sitting up and your eyes are wide so you can see everything and kind of prepare for danger. And that's such a miraculous thing. That's a strength response. That's not a sign of weakness or dysfunction. And so when we are overwhelmed, like when I look back at my 24-year-old self, I could very easily tell a shame story about how I resisted those feelings and how bad that was, and how I really wish I could have just gone through the acute grief more, in an organized fashion, and I should have gone to therapy right away and all this other stuff. But I have a lot of sympathy for old me, and I also have a lot of faith in my nervous system saying we are not ready to do this at this moment. And when we are ready, and it may be an inconvenient moment, we will let you know that it's time to feel, And so I think that
That's a
our
great
nerve,
story.
yeah,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right. That's not a shame story. That's like and I think like I see a lot right now, people are saying we've just lived through a global traumatic event that's still going on, right? The world that we live in is unprecedented and terrifying in many ways. And instead of acknowledge that, we're kind of pushing that down, which is fine, but we're pathologizing a lot of our behaviors that are out of necessity. And so people will say like, I dissociated for an hour and I watched TV. No, you zoned out for an hour because your nervous system is fried and it's trying to help you regulate. And that's very healthy. And if I just wish we could sort of turn to these things and understand them from the viewpoint of empowerment and adaptation instead of pathology and disease. Because of course, if you're now watching TV 14 hours a day and you can't go to work, what started out as an adaptation has grown maladaptive. And you want to be able to kind of peel that back and figure out, okay, what did I need? Why did I choose that activity? And how can I replace it so that I can function in the world? What else do I need? But we can't do that when we're looking at it all with a shame lens,
Mm-hmm. So the subtitle of your book says, I would ask you that question. So what could you tell us that people who are now listening to this, what would they need to know to be able to take them back to their own life? Because one of the things I feel very passionate about and also saddened about is those people who are to some degree, without using these words in a diminishing way, but stuck or as you were just saying, maladaptive in their grieving process, stuck in a way that they say nothing ever gets better. Like some of the memes out there say grief is forever, it's a life sentence. And I don't believe that. That was not my experience. But so what would these people need to know or to hear to be able to at least start to pivot towards that? Okay, I might not believe it, that there is a way back to my life, but I can take this first step. Like the words ring back from one of my recent clients that I accompanied for 2 years after the loss of her 2-month-old baby. And she said, in the recent session, she said, Natalie, I didn't believe when you first said, this will change. You might not believe me, but you can trust me that with my years of experience, I know this is going to happen. And she couldn't believe it, but it did. But what would those people, in your words, need to know to have at least the pivot of belief or hope to tap into the resilience that there is a way back to living life joyfully? Yeah.
I have 5 things.
Ooh.
5 things. Number 1, if you're in that acute stage that, the morning after this has just happened and you are like, I don't know how to eat, I don't know how to breathe. You almost go back to a newborn state. Like, I can't, existence is unfathomable. Your only job right now is to hold on. And that's a lot. And if you can just hold on, I promise you it gets better.
So the person that listens to that says, what do you mean by hold on? Like how, what? Hold on to what?
Hold on to this moment, this breath, yourself, do the next thing you need to do. And if it doesn't make any sense, it doesn't matter. Lie on the floor, hang out in the bathroom, eat ice cream for breakfast, like whatever comes to you as a sort of like sign of life, that's your next anchor, like
Good. Very practical.
hold on. Yeah. And I think that we don't go that granular because I think that a lot of us don't want to look at those acute stages because they're so awful. But just if you can't shower today, that's fine. Right. Like be as kind to yourself as you possibly can, and just hold on, just get to the next breath. That's all you have to focus on. And then the next one, and then the next one. And they do get easier. I know that that seems impossible, but they do. And I think the second thing is get help, right? When our nervous systems are fried, we don't have access to all the parts of our brain that we usually do. And so we often need to rely on the rationality and the calmness and the trust and the hope and the imagination of other people and their brains that do have access to those things. And so, however you can reach out to help, for help, do that. Get a therapist, go to a group, even if you hate it, right? Like, just make sure that you are reaching out, even if it feels like nobody could ever understand what you're going through, because that's how you find those people with the flashlights who will say, the next step is here, then the next one is here,
And to add on to number two, to what you were just saying, I mean, as a side note from trauma understanding, if you go into a group or if you find some support, you will undoubtedly be co-regulated. Hopefully, if it's a good person, but even if it's just a friend who doesn't know what to do, just sitting with someone is co-regulating your nervous system.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The rhythms of our bodies literally sync. And so if you can get yourself next to someone who has a slightly lower heart rate when you're anxious, it will go down a little bit, which is what a miracle. Like what,
it's amazing.
How do we explain that? It is. The third thing is drop the shame because it's making you blind. I think we have so much shame. And I mean, there are natural moments in the initial stages of grief, of guilt, and they serve a purpose, right? And so whatever you're feeling is okay. You don't have to judge that. But I think if you're dealing with shame about your grief, it will make you blind to the people around you who can help, or the things that you might need. It might make you blind to yourself. Sometimes in these acute stages of any kind of emotional anything, we reach for things out of desperation. We reach for drugs. Sometimes we reach for alcohol. We reach for sex in situations that we wouldn't normally. Like, we reach for these things out of desperation. And then I think we double back and shame ourselves into oblivion about it, instead of realizing that our bodies have needs. And sometimes we reach for things that are not sustainable as regulation tools. And that's okay. Because if you can peel away the shame lens, then you can realize, okay, what did my body need? Well, if I chose alcohol, I needed to be leveled down. How can I level myself down using something different or in a safer way than, potentially misusing alcohol or something like that? But I think we do so much damage when we shame ourselves in these, well, in general, but especially in these acute phases. And then, what were you going to say?
Yeah.
Yes,
3,
4. Well, that was 3.
I'm just waiting for all these things.
This next one is related, which is that your body is a barometer, and it is giving you data 24/7 about what it needs. And it has a wisdom that is not accessible to your mind. And so if the sooner you can tune into the barometer and learn how to read it, the better, because your body is telling you whether you need rest. I think like one of the hardest life lessons in general, whether you're dealing with trauma in this moment or not, is learning like when to rest and when to push yourself. And I think until you realize that your body is a barometer, you will always be reading it wrong and kind of pushing in the wrong direction, or resting when you should be connecting with other people. And so if you can tune into what your body is asking for, it is telling you. Right? Like if you're kind of blasting through your grief and you're going to work and finding that you're in chronic pain all the time, that may be a sign that your body needs some rest. If you're resting and you're finding yourself having these, totally sleepless nights and unable to regulate yourself, it could be that you need to be in the presence of someone else who can help you co-regulate, right? Like, do you need to be activated or do you need to be sort of regulated? That's a basic question that we should all be able to ask our bodies all the time, And then the last thing is, we have this tendency, I always have this, because people talk about grief waves, I always have this image of like standing in the ocean. And we have a tendency to turn away from grief. I think that's natural based on the culture that we live in and sort of the task that grief calls us to. Turn and face the waves. Because when you're facing the waves, if you think about actually standing on the beach, if your back is to the waves, they will knock you over every time they hit. And every time you hit the ground and you're surprised by the fact that the sand feels like concrete and that the wave, which is just water, feels like someone just hit you with a brick wall, right? So if you can turn to face the waves, you can at least see them on the horizon and you can kind of brace yourself and you can learn how to sort of let them hit you in a way that doesn't knock you over. And then it becomes more of a ride and less of a sort of violent attack.
I love the way you use metaphors. I mean, you've listened to the
I did.
metaphors episodes that I have. And also in terms of the grief as an ocean or the wave or the water, I think it's also one of the stories that came, or the image that came when you were talking about that is, it's not just watch the ocean or the wave that's coming, but watch the landscape. Orient yourself, because like the picture that came once, I was standing at the Great Ocean Road in Australia and I was standing looking at the ocean. It was beautiful. And suddenly a wave hit me from behind.
Oh no.
So something, it just came and I was actually just focusing straight ahead, but watching and metaphorically speaking about what's happening around me, what activates me, what is going on with my nervous system. And that ties into the barometer of the system to say, well, do I need to step further back maybe from the ocean that the wave is lesser in height, or can I see something that is helpful?
Right. Or are there people on the beach and we can link arms? And when we do that, this huge wave, hits us in a different way because it disperses the energy. I love that. I love that.
Wow. So what would you say as a way to round this or to summarize this? I mean, you have some great experience, personal and also professional, with all those things. For those people who are listening, I mean, I've had all these ties to different episodes that I've already had in conversation. One of the upcoming episodes is also Dana that I just spoke to last week. I love her. Yeah. And she's talked about her grief experience and the nervous system responses. So it ties very much with yours, which will come around the same time. But if we're looking at that for people listening to this now, what would you find that could be helpful for those listening who are dealing with the intersection of grief and trauma? What would you summarize as that you found both personal and professionally?
There's so much to say. I think that, sometimes people will ask, because there's a chapter in Unbroken about traumatic loss, and sometimes we like to make hierarchies, right? And so sometimes people will ask, is grief traumatic? Are all losses trauma? Is trauma the same thing? What is it? How bad does the loss have to be for it to be traumatic? And the way that I define trauma is just an unbearable emotional experience that lacks a relational home.
I love that definition of yours. I've heard it before.
Thank you.
Say it again. Say it again.
It's an unbearable emotional experience that lacks a relational home.
And say a little bit more about it, because I know how you define that a little bit more.
Yeah, I love the word unbearable because I think it does a lot of work, right? Like most of our experiences we bear. They may be inconvenient, they may be upsetting, they may be bittersweet, they may be euphoric, but we can bear them and put them away. Our experiences, just like the things in our homes, need a dwelling place. And when we go through something that's profoundly overwhelming, our nervous systems kick into gear into these emergency coping tools. And the result of that is that we have sort of these fragmented memories that we sometimes have a hard time categorizing or putting away. And so as a result, they sort of stay alive. They don't sort of recede into the past. They stay very present. And what we need is a relational home, which is just a place where anyone can relate to that sort of wounded part of you with empathy and help you find a dwelling place for your experiences that feel fragmented or feel too alive. And so I think that in a grief-phobic culture, grief is pretty much by definition an unbearable emotional experience, just because of the sort of burden it puts on your brain and body, like in Mary Frances O'Connor's work, she talks in the Grieving Brain, she talks about how grief is an incredible learning process because you have to remap the entire world without that other person. You can't bear that on your own. And I think in a culture that is grief phobic, we have a really hard time sometimes finding a relational home for our grief. And so what that means is that I think any loss that we experience has the potential to become a lasting trauma. And again, that's not a sign that we are broken. That's a sign that that our culture is, and that we need help. And so I think that to kind of wrap it up, know that your nervous system is strong, that your body has wisdom that's not accessible to your conscious mind, and that there are always people who can hold a flashlight onto that path.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
I don't think I need to say anything else. Just beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, MC.
No, thank you. This went by so fast.
And also you make it so accessible. I mean, I know with your knowledge and depth of experience and professional on this experience, and as a researcher, you make it accessible. And that's what I think is important for those who are dealing with that, because I remember in the throes of it in myself, in my own experience, I felt like I'm going crazy and I didn't know how to do that. Even though I was trained in grief, I was retrained from a personal experience in a depth that I wouldn't have known from the grief experience that I had prior to the loss of my daughter and my mother.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Do you feel now, like having that professional experience, having that training, and then having the lived experience, do you feel like you are less sort of afraid of grief? Or do you still find yourself sort of, this is a purely selfish question.
Definitely less afraid. Okay. Because, I mean, for me, I'm very comfortable being with people who are grieving, and even in the raw grieving state. So maybe I have to differentiate this question. Am I afraid of grieving with others, like as my profession being with them? No, absolutely not. Mm-hmm. Am I afraid of my own grief when it comes again? So of course, in terms of losing a very dear loved one, I think I'm selfishly afraid of the loss more than the grief.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So the grieving I know I can do, but it's the loss that is annoying and just as well from what you were saying about the connection that you have with your parents, I remember one conversation I had with about grief dreams, and I dream a lot about my mother, and I have these moments with my mother in my dreams, but obviously it's different than a physical connection or conversations. And I think this is an interesting question that you pose. Like, yes, I'm very comfortable with people grieving, and with my own grief, the loss that comes before, that's what scares me. But the grieving experience is just, I think I trust my body enough that I know it can do it. And I have these imaginations. What if my daughter dies? What if my partner dies? Mm-hmm. I'm more comfortable with certain other death in my relational world, because I feel if certain people in my life, in my family die, yes, I'm ready for that in terms of their age, in terms of our relationship.
Sure. Right.
But with others, I say no.
I know. Yeah. That's such a beautiful.
How about you?
I worry about this a lot. Because I think, you can kind of have like a little bit of a hubris when you think about something so much. Or maybe I should just speak for myself. I can find when I feel like I know something, I'm like, well, I know that, and so I don't need to worry about that anymore. But grief has reminded me that that's not always, that it will knock you over, right? That's not always the case. And so I do worry about that sometimes, and sort of this, like, is there some threshold, of losses that once they start to compile, that you can't anymore. But I think I have kind of an infinite capacity to worry. which serves me well in other areas. But I love the distinction between like that resonates for me a lot. I'm afraid of the loss and much less afraid of the grief, because that's what we're bracing for, right? Is that the terribleness of the loss, the grief, like that's a path we have traveled. So that's really helpful.
So I always end with my guests with the rapid fire question. Shall we do that now?
Yes.
So grieving and trauma means?
Being blown wide open.
And healing means?
Understanding that is painful and also beautiful.
And what have you learned about yourself in the light of loss and trauma?
I am a whole lot stronger than I thought.
And what would be one thing that you wish people knew about loss and trauma?
That it's beautiful. Right? Like I think that we want to categorize things as either inherently good or inherently bad, and trauma and loss, like I say, they blow you open, and that's just in the same way as like experiences that you have that create awe. They can shake everything up. You can't go back to the world before they happened. And of course, there's an incredible amount of pain that comes with that, but there's so much depth and meaning and beauty that comes too.
And what would be one specific thing that has changed since your losses and trauma that you wouldn't want to miss?
I'm a completely different person. I think that I was very restricted before this. I was very sort of rational and you just got to keep going. And this has really made me a lot softer and more capable of being with the unknown, which is expansive.
Well, this has been such a lovely conversation.
Oh, thank you.
I always feel a bit odd to say lovely conversation when you talk about grief and loss and trauma, but to me, this is my passion project. And I think it's same as what you were saying. It's beautiful to see what comes from it. Not that we wanted it, but it came from it anyway. So thank you so much for your time, MC.
Oh, thank you. This was really, really beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.